The Titans signed Calvin Ridley to a 4-year, $92 million contract, and I don't think it's a stretch to say that Calvin Ridley is the best route runner in Titans franchise history. If somebody wants to hook me up with the Derek Mason All-22, I wasn't really grinding film like that in 3rd grade, but just in terms of pure separation ability against man coverage, I mean, in the modern era, it's easily between Calvin Ridley and A.J. Brown, and I think Brown's definitely the better receiver overall, but I would give Ridley the nod as a route runner. I do want to start by briefly looking at the contract. So 4 years, 92 mil, that's 23 average cap hit per year. 47 million is guaranteed at signing, and after 2 years, they could cut him with a $10 million dead cap hit. So at the minimum, it's a 2-year top 10 receiver contract for a player that, if I had to rank all the receivers, I would guess he'd end up somewhere in the 15 to 20 range. It's an overpay, but I don't really have a problem with it. When you're a team like the Titans that fails to draft any good players over multiple draft classes, you're going to end up with these gaps as far as re-signing your own players, and you're going to head into free agency with a ton of cap space. The ideal way to build a team is through the draft, and the track record of big free agent signings is not great at any position, but the money has to go somewhere. So if the Calvin Ridley signing's a bust, they're in the exact same position they were in before they signed him. So yeah, I don't have a major problem with the compensation. If it's a complete failure, you can get out of it after 2 years. I'll be honest though, my first thought when a team adds Calvin Ridley is not how soon can they get rid of him. He's already a proven productive receiver, and even though he is a little bit older, I actually think there's some upside to get even more out of him. With the Titans specifically, he gives them exactly what they were missing at receiver, which is someone that can get open. This plot was tweeted out by a PFF employee. He usually posts these to update them every week, and I think it's one of the best statistical lenses that we have to look at receiver play. So PFF grades receivers basically in 3 phases on every play. They grade the route running, not for aesthetics, but just purely creating separation. They grade the catch, and then they grade after the catch. So the x-axis has the PFF separation grade, and the y-axis is a combination of the catch point and yak grade. And Calvin Ridley ranks 11th in separation grade and about average in catch point and yak grade. I think after going through all of his tape from this past year, that matches up with the eye test pretty well. And outside of Chris Moore, every other Titans receiver was firmly below average in separation grade. You've got Treylon Burks, DeAndre Hopkins, and Nick Westbrook-Akine as the other qualifying receivers, and none of them could really get open with any sort of consistency. So having a player that can reliably create separation is obviously going to be huge for Will Levis. It's going to give him so many more easy chunk plays, and hopefully a lot fewer times where he's having to force things into tight windows. And I actually think Calvin Ridley's a player that can sort of be unlocked by having him run a more diverse route tree. If we look at his route tree over the course of his career, not including 2021, because he didn't play that many snaps. But you can see last year he ran a career high percentage of curls and comebacks, a career high in go routes. He had career lows in slants, posts, corners, outs, and the second lowest dig route percentage of his career at 10.3%. Jacksonville basically walled off a 7 by 20 yard section outside the hashes and said, "Here you go, Calvin, hang out in this square." Ridley's a player that can run the entire route tree. He can be a complete route runner and separate at every level, but the Jags were a very sideline-centered passing game with a lot of 1 and 3 step drops. I think part of that has to do with them not trusting their pass protection. Trevor Lawrence had one of the lowest time to throws in the NFL, so they were getting the ball out quick, and they had Calvin Ridley kind of in stop route jail. But with all that being said, I don't blame Press Taylor too much for just wanting to have Calvin Ridley run a bunch of comeback routes. That is probably what he does best, and really he just has the complete skill set to win at every level on the vertical plane. He has 4.43 speed. Because he does so many other things well, I wouldn't just naturally label him as a deep threat, but he absolutely is a threat over the top. I think at his best, he's going to win the majority of his routes in the 10 to 20 yard range, but he can absolutely separate vertically. Right here, he wipes down the press coverage from Christian Fulton, hits that second gear to create separation. Good job tracking the ball over his shoulder. When he just has to beat press and outrun a corner, he can do that at a high level, and that's going to give you explosive plays, but it's also going to put it in the cornerback's mind that this is a vertical threat that they're covering. He's not a player where you can just squat on underneath routes and trust that you're going to be able to recover downfield. And that opens up a lot of opportunities for one of the premier stop route runners in the NFL. There's a few guys you could put in this tier, but it's hard to get much better at running curls and comebacks than what you see from Calvin Ridley. The first element of that is just being able to stop, being able to decelerate. So much is made, especially during the draft, about acceleration and speed, but being able to stop your momentum is arguably just as important. If all you have is speed, corners can just give you cushion, take away the go route, and then when you try to cut that off to a comeback, if you can't come to balance in 2 or 3 steps, the corner's going to be right there to undercut the passing window. So you see right here against Kyer Elam, he's stemming downfield at full speed. He's attacking the cornerback's cushion. His head is pretty much level. There's nothing in his body language that's selling that he's about to cut this route off. And then once he gets to about 13 or 14 yards, it's just a couple throttle steps, instantly cuts that route off, and he's got an automatic 3 yards of separation, plus he's working back to the football. Another one here where you actually see a couple of his other skills. Good job evading the two-hand punch at the line of scrimmage. Right off the snap, the corner's in recovery mode. And then as he accelerates downfield, he's looking back to the quarterback, which signals to Zion McCollum, the corner, that they're trying to hit him over the outside shoulder. So he opens up inside, looks back to the football, and then Ridley almost pulls off one of the cleanest route breaks of the year. He actually stumbles out of his break, but he created so much separation, he could have taken his time getting up off the ground. Another good example here against the Panthers of hitting top speed, sinking his hips, stopping on a dime, opening up to the sideline. Easy 12, 13-yard gain. And this is really all over his tape. I'm not going to break down every single play, but just effortless deceleration, corners trailing off for 5 yards before he's able to sink his hips and mirror that stop route. If you got a quarterback that can throw with zip to the sideline, it's a lot of 15-yard handoffs. So he has the athletic ability to run these routes, but I think what takes it to the next level is his salesmanship and nuance and his ability to attack leverage, attack blind spots, and make corners feel uncomfortable. When you get a cover 3 corner that's in a side turn, he's got his back to the sideline, he wants to stay wider than the widest route to his side. That's just easy money for Calvin Ridley. So right here, Kenny Moore's in bail technique. If Calvin Ridley just continued on a straight line and cut off this route, he might be able to win the rep, but it would be within Kenny Moore's field of vision, and if he timed it right, he might be able to break up the pass. So what Ridley does is he stems his route directly upfield for about 10 yards. If he widened out immediately, then Kenny Moore would just mirror that, and then all of a sudden you've lost all of your space to the sideline to work with. So the first 10 yards are basically in a straight line, and you can see he's also altering his tempo throughout the stem. But then at 10 to 12 yards, he's going to abruptly widen out and attack the corner's blind spot. That makes Kenny Moore think he's trying to win a late outside release. He opens up to the sideline expecting Calvin Ridley to be running across his face down the field, but because he lost sight of him, Ridley can just sink his hips, cut off his route, and get 6 yards of separation, wait for the ball to come to him. Another very similar example right here. Again, you've got a bail tech corner. The stem is going to be in a straight line downfield. Like I said, he's not widening out early and taking an immediate outside release because that would signal to Kyer Elam that he needs to widen out, and then he wouldn't have all this space outside the numbers to toy around with him. But then at 12 yards, he's going to attack the blind spot, threaten vertically. That gets Elam to open up to the sideline. He's expecting Ridley to cross his face, but he cut off his route, and he's got 4 or 5 yards of separation to wait for the ball. Another example here against the Titans, just a linear vertical stem. At the last second, he attacks the blind spot, doesn't really manipulate the corner's hips, but it forces him to continue to get depth, and it creates more space for Ridley to cut off the route. And then final stop route example, I promise there are more routes we're going to look at, but there are so many of these on Ridley's tape. This play, he's lined up in the slot. He ends up being the number 1 because they do a switch release, but very tight pre-snap alignment against a corner with heavy outside leverage. He's running like a 7 stop here where he kind of fakes the corner and then sinks down right on the 50. So he does basically a spray release where you're just attacking the cornerback and trying to even out that leverage as much as possible. Again, at 10 to 12 yards, he attacks the blind spot. For a moment, Stingley thinks there might be a route developing over to the sideline, so he's got to widen out a little bit, and that just softens up the coverage for Ridley to sit down in between these 2 defenders. Lawrence has to evade pressure. Good job by Ridley of extending that separation, keeping himself available. Crazy tight window throw here. You would have thought Stingley could get a hand on it, but good focus by Ridley to bring this one in. So So Ridley's pretty much automatic on these routes. He led the NFL in curls and comeback routes run, and he had the second most receiving yards on those routes. It's a very similar dynamic to a player like Deontay Johnson under Matt Canada, where it's like, yes, you're elite at running stop routes, and that should probably be the route that you run most frequently, but he can run other things. He doesn't need to be running 30% curls and comebacks. And then you didn't see this as often, but he's very capable of cutting it off to a back shoulder fade. We'll get more into his ball skills later, but very good coordination making these difficult adjustments along the sideline. When Ridley did run horizontal breaking routes, I was equally impressed by his fluidity, his technique, and his nuance. Right here, it's 3rd and 5. The Jags are on the right hash, and Ridley's trying to run a speed out to the sticks. If he just ran this as a vanilla speed out, there's not really enough space to work with here, and Shaq Griffin would most likely be able to clamp this. So Ridley has to find a way to create more space to the sideline here. He's gonna inside release. That forces the corner to turn his hips inside. He sticks the landing with an exaggerated Euro step with the left foot. At this point, he's compressed the corner's alignment by about 2 yards, so he has enough space to break out to the sideline. He could honestly just break right now and win the route, but instead he attacks the blind spot, then he fakes back inside before finally breaking out to the sideline and converting the 3rd down. At first glance, it might kind of seem like unnecessary footwork and just playing with your food, but he only ends up catching this about 1.5 yards past the sticks, and you can see while he's doing all this extra attacking the cornerback's leverage, he's actually gaining ground upfield, so that extra 1.5 yards to 2 yards actually ended up making the difference as far as moving the sticks. Same play here from the same formation. Calvin Ridley's running the exact same route on Derek Stingley, except a little bit deeper and a little bit less disrespectful. On this play, it's 3rd and 10. Again, Ridley wants to run something out-breaking because you got this backside safety waiting to bite on anything over the middle, but they're on the right hash, so there isn't a ton of space to work with. So he's gonna hard inside release. Again, he really sells that final step with the left foot to try to get Derek Stingley leaning inside as much as possible. He crosses over back to the outside, but again, all of this was to create space between himself and the sideline, so he doesn't really widen out much initially at all. He gets far enough outside that he's attacking the corner's blind spot, but he's still preserving that space so that he can accelerate out of his break and create separation. And you see the head fakes in the body language. Even though he's about to break outside, he's still facing downfield towards the end zone, and then he cuts it off horizontally and they get the 1st down. And then one more example of the same play with the same route. It's not as clean because he gets held out of his break, but he's still able to condense the corner's alignment and then separate to the outside. Right here, he's got Eric Garror in the red zone. I could just skip over this play based on that introduction. You probably know what's going to happen. It's press coverage with about 2 yards of cushion pre-snap. Ridley foot fires into his space to eat up that cushion. He's just waiting on the corner to make a move. He throws up this outside hand. Ridley blows by that easily. Now he's past Garrett's outside hip. The corner's in trail technique with underneath leverage. He's trying to read the receiver's body language to get a tell on the break. So Ridley flashes his eyes to the quarterback. He starts to bend this route inside, and then at the last second, he cuts it off to the sideline. This is one of those where it's hard to tell if it's inaccurate or miscommunication. I lean towards the latter. Based on when Lawrence releases the ball, I'm guessing he's expecting Ridley to cut this route off 1 step earlier, but that's all stuff for them to iron out in practice. The main point here is the salesmanship and the change of direction skills. This route against the Saints I included just because there's no one on the Titans roster that is capable of doing anything close to this kind of body movement. Marshawn Lattimore is always right there with the speed turn, but man, that is a crisp break. Right here, he's lined up in the slot. He's running an out-breaking route, but he's got an outside leverage corner. So until the very last second, he's selling this seam route right down the middle of Roger McCreary and Amani Hooker, and then at the last second, it's just a clean horizontal break, 4 to 5 yards of separation. And then last route running clip here, just beating the soft shoe press from Marlon Humphrey, too shifty for most corners to mirror at full speed. The last kind of phase of route running to discuss with Calvin Ridley is beating press coverage. If you aren't already subscribed to Reception Perception, Matt Harmon over there does outstanding work with receivers. It would probably be one of the 2 or 3 last subscriptions that I would cancel if I had to. to, but he charts these receivers. He does the cool data visualization with the route tree, and he puts all the data up in tables. He's got like success rate against press coverage, success rate against man, all the different types of routes that they're running. He had Calvin Ridley with a 66.7% success rate against press in 2023, which is slightly below average, and it's a lot lower than 78.6 and 75, which is where he was with the Falcons. I'm not sure how many games that's based on. I know sometimes he does like a 6-game sample size maybe. So heading into the tape, I had kind of lower expectations for Calvin Ridley versus press, and I wouldn't say he was automatic. There were times that he got hung up by press coverage. I watched every one of his targets and then every route from his 6 least productive games, because I figured those would be the ones where he was getting beat by press, and I didn't chart it or anything, so I'll defer to Matt's numbers. I didn't really notice press coverage being a major problem for Calvin Ridley. Joey Porter Jr. is the one matchup that I would say is a decisive loss, but to me, he's already a top 5 press corner just purely based on what he can do at the line of scrimmage, and he pretty much dominated everyone in press last year except Amari Cooper. And L'Jarius Sneed got him once or twice. I think one of the Saints corners, Paulson Adebo, had a nice rep on him. Over a pretty large sample size, I didn't notice press as a major issue for Calvin Ridley. He's not really going to power through physical press coverage. He does need to use his quickness and footwork to evade press, but he's really good at doing that, so I don't have any concerns on that front. So everything I've said up to this point has been pretty much universally positive, but there are a couple key weaknesses to Calvin Ridley's game that's keeping him outside of that top 5, top 10 type of receiver. The first is that he just doesn't have great hands. He has an 8.2% career drop rate. For reference, the median drop rate last year was 6.7% for receivers. The year before that, it was 5.5%. And the last 3 seasons, he's been at 8.4, 8.8, and 8.2. That's in the territory for a receiver where it's kind of limiting but not debilitating. 10% is usually the cutoff where I would say, okay, this guy has real drop issues. But with Ridley, it's kind of just a persistent thing that he's going to drop 6 to 8 targets per year. This season specifically, there were also a lot of plays where he didn't get both feet in bounds. Rewatching the entire Jags offense, it's kind of jarring, not just Calvin Ridley, but the total amount of like should have been touchdown passes where the receiver only got 1 foot in bounds. One of the reasons I'm a little bit higher on Trevor Lawrence than I think most Titans fans are. I think his stat line could have easily looked a lot better, but that's another conversation. The main point is that I think Ridley's hands are inconsistent but not terrible. He's also not a great contested catch receiver. There are some flashes and some examples of him winning at the catch point, but overall he's not that big, average play strength, can't really box out defenders that effectively. It's not a Jerry Jeudy situation where like Jeudy will just straight up not play the ball in the air. He just has limited effectiveness in that area. And then the other downside or weakness with Calvin Ridley is that he doesn't give you a whole lot after the catch. In his 5 seasons in the NFL, he's only eclipsed 4 missed tackles forced 1 time. He pretty consistently ranks near the bottom of the league in yak per reception. For his career, he averages 3.3 yards after the catch per reception. Now, the routes that he's running are not very conducive to a whole lot of yak opportunities. You know, those speed outs on 3rd and 5 that we were going through, there's not a lot of yak potential on those plays where you're falling out of bounds. But he's kind of shifty, not very powerful with the ball in his hands, and for the most part, he's just gonna get open and take what you give him. So overall, I'm a fan of this signing. It's definitely my favorite, maybe second to Lloyd Cushenberry. Tony Pollard and Chido Awuzie were like my favorite players in 2022. I thought Chido was honestly on an all-pro trajectory in 2022 before he tore his Achilles. Last year was understandably not that great. Still basically a league average corner last year, but nowhere near the level that he had been playing at. With him, you're basically banking on him returning to prior form, which I think there's a good chance he will, but there's always some risk involved with that. Tony Pollard I thought was a decent signing. A lot of people kind of have a negative view on Tony Pollard because he was coming back from an injury. He started off the season very slow, and there were some high profile moments, especially in goal line situations where he couldn't punch it in. But down the stretch, his level of play really increased, and I like the idea of committing to always having a dynamic running back on the field regardless of whether or not Tyjae Spears is in. Tony Pollard can pass block, he can generate explosive plays, he can run between the tackles. Doesn't have the best hands, but he's an adequate third third down back. So those two signings I would classify as decent. Mason Rudolph and Sadiq Charles are depth signings to me. If Bill Callahan can turn Sadiq Charles into something, then I will be a believer for life. And the one signing that I didn't like was Kenneth Murray at linebacker. I am kind of intrigued about the pass rushing element of it. Watching the Ravens defense last year, they were sending pressure from every single direction, and that's really the one thing that Kenneth Murray does well at this point. So if Denard Wilson can continue to unlock that pass rushing aspect of his game, I think that could be a positive. But Murray becoming a true high quality 3-down linebacker, I would say would be a development, to put it nicely. And I don't think it's wise to invest a ton of resources and draft capital into linebacker, but it is a position where you don't want to be one of the 3 worst teams in the NFL. Not that you want that for any position, but some terrible linebackers can absolutely wreck your defense. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy the video, make sure to like and subscribe. Also, let me know in the comments any NFL teams or players that you'd like me to cover.